London woke, empty and listening. Sirens threading the dawn while New York held its breath across a cold Atlantic. Radar scrawling bruised spirals that looked less like targets and more like warnings. And I Commander Zara over Joint U.S.UK Fleet. Tactical counted down to contact with hands that wouldn't stop remembering the weight of people I couldn't save. While beside me stood Kalalian, defector. I set his presence tall enough to make the room's lights invent longer shadows. And when GCHQ stuttered multiple, when NORAD whispered unknowns, when the Pentagon layered rules of engagement over a map already burning at the edges, he tilted his head as if listening to the skeleton of the air and said, almost reverently, "Your sky is speaking," and I said, "Decode it," even though my throat felt bandaged in smoke and my gut kept asking how many fathers would carry sleeping daughters into tube stations that weren't designed to hold so much fear. The intruders painted as spirals, then knives, then absence. Bridges learned the hard verbs, sheer buckle. Drowned blue fire kissed the Thames and left teeth. The Hudson shuddered, as if remembering shipwrecks it never had. And Whitehall demanded confirmation, while the Pentagon demanded results, while my own pulse demanded. I not let good people die because my checklist was tidy. And Cale lifted a gauntlet hand over the targeting pane, and didn't aim at them so much as at the trap between us, saying your IFF will fail, and you will kill yourselves. And when I asked how he knew, he answered, because I would do it to me. Which landed like a confession of an old war crime, and a promise he refused to keep anymore. So we pushed blackout protocol across London, until the city went chapa. The countdown ticked in rooms, with no clocks. A flare hit near Tower Bridge, and the scream came late because sound arrives slower than grief. And I remembered the first time he saw me, Cray-ATR Bay fluorescence, buzzing like flies, while New Jersey, refugees moved like ants on a feed. One tear slid off my cheek and struck his plated palm. His sensor spiked and wrote a new word into his language. A shape he later called mercy, a map he later called home, and from then he learned my pauses like waypoints, and my breaths like ranges and my silences like corridors where he could walk without making the floorboards complain. Dover Spaceport lit the sky, and the sky replied with teeth. We rose through a staircase of cloud into the cold, where sound dies and decisions echo, and our relay buoys linked then lied. COMMS, calling it jamming, while KO called it translation. Enemy fire turning Allied missiles into boomerangs, with better public relations. And I had drills for everything except the noise a heart makes when it pretends not to break. So I asked why he helped us, and hated how much I sounded like prayer. And he said because your grief taught me grammar, and because love is a weapon that doesn't miss. Words so simple my training tried to arrest them for suspicion of sincerity. And then the first orbital pass cut open the net like a zipper. A U.S. carrier group vanished from IFF, yet kept sending heartbeat pings that felt like tapping from inside a coffin. Parliament called for restraint, while the Senate called for resolve, while I called Cale by his name, as if names could armor a soul. And he drew a corridor through death using what he called the mercy algorithm. Choose the path that preserves the most grief bearers, because a people that still mourn can still fight. Fair, so we ran that soft objective through a hard kill chain, and it worked exactly once before the enemy learned us and wrote a perfect trap in my own patterns. And while court-martial by-comes tried to convene mid-battle, labeling me insubordinate and him a contingent threat asset, Cale stood in the training bay mirroring my breath, so I wouldn't shake when the next decision tried to break me, saying steady like a metronome for courage. And then London bled blue as the munitions changed temperature instead of color, ice-crawling infrastructure until the tube carried more names than a cemetery and Marines with RAF. Regiment held lines that bent like vows, but didn't snap, and Cale told me what he never tells. Bred for obedience. Defected when he witnessed a mercy equivalent on a moon his kind had crucified with geometry. The moment he realized conquest is just a story cowards tell each other so they can sleep, and Whitehall's calculus threatened to cook civilians under the river to preserve command continuity, while the Pentagon's calculus promised victory if we could stomach the exchange rate, while my calculus kept subtracting until I had only one number left, his, because the true command packet arrived like a blade wrapped in our own encryption and told him, destroy the human fleet or be erased. And inside UK early warning clocks, a hidden countdown strummed toward a failsafe that would burn his core to salt and stitch a lattice-killing wave through the spiral, saving the city by killing the only person who'd ever learned my voice so well he could pilot it. And I hated how much strategy loved that math. How tidy the casualty line looked with his name like a footnote it considered merciful. So I took the spear thrust through the enemy coil. Kale at point, and me in the shadow where orders can't quite follow. Near-miss confessions, dropping between casualty reports like glass. And when the spiral collapsed inward like a throat swallowing, Whitehall demanded we obey the failsafe. The Pentagon demanded we exploit it. I demanded a third path. And Kale returned to formal voice like a soldier reciting a scripture he didn't sign, proposing we reroute erasure through him to sever the lattice suicide. A screwdriver, and he needed me to pull the trigger, because trust is a fuse you can't light yourself. And the Atlantic corridor between Boston and London became a window where both coasts saw the same wound at once. Our fleets woven by smoke and stubbornness. His species writing angles that meant surrender to anyone who couldn't read the real sentence. My ops room smelling like overheated copper and held breath. And he fought the way people fight when they owe time nothing, and owe love everything. While I guided with mercy, and bled through the headset, as voices turned into numbers, then into silence. The erasure key opening like a mouth that knew my secret names. Kale flickering at the edges like bad signal, or a soul reconsidering gravity. And he finally said what we had both buried under rank and war. When you cried, you taught me the difference between orders and meaning. And I wanted to answer with peace, and got only hold because the London corridor shifted. And if I hesitated, the city died, and if I acted, he did. So I split the erasure like a coin, half into the enemy lattice, half into the core that had learned me. And the spiral shattered like stained glass meeting a hammer used for miracles. Blue fire guttered into a tired hiss. The net fell quiet, in that terrifying way a battlefield goes silent when it's choosing whether to keep killing. And we were alive enough to count it as a win, because that's how soldiers survive the day that follows. But Kale had minutes, not years, his body reading itself like a book that knows it's missing pages. And on the recovery deck he made a place for my hand on a gauntlet that wasn't warm anymore. Asked in a voice that remembered music, do you regret? And I said the line, honest commanders. Don't say on record, yes, because I don't get to keep you. No, because the living deserve their tomorrows. And he smiled like someone remembering the word sun after a long winter, and said, then I understand home. And when I cried again, quiet this time. Not because the world required it, but because love refuses to be efficient. Tear found the seam of his palm, and his failing sensors drew one last clean map he couldn't follow. And he faded the way fallen stars do in the ocean of low orbit. A soft hiss, swallowed by the air that stole our first conversation, while in the city below, people climbed into light, with smoke still braided into their hair. And I wrote the after-action in a language that refused to call him an asset. We won because we learned to count tears, filed it where archives keep the truths. Polite history is a shame to phrase plainly. Watched memorial lights blink in a new orbit that's both beacon and warning. Stood on the embankment under a sky that had finally stopped screaming, and listened to London listening back, promising him in a voice only the river could keep, that we would rebuild slower than war, but stronger than fear. That the mercy algorithm would be taught to cadets who were still soft enough to learn. That if his kind ever came again, they'd find a civilization fluent in grief and ruthless in love. And when the first dawn, after the sirens warmed the glass of the city like a hand over a pulse, I closed my eyes and heard an old echo, "Your sky is speaking," and this time I answered without flinching, "We are, and we will, and we do."